this is a normal individual. This is a T2 axial slice, which is a transverse slice at the level of your mid-thigh. This is how you see a normal bulk muscle that you want. Very little subcutaneous fat, and the muscle is all gray. So these darker areas are the fascia separating.
On the left side of the image.
Yes, on the left side of the image. This dark line here is the fascia separating the muscles, and you can see that all the muscles are gray because they are only muscle, lean muscle. If you go to the right side, you're going to see that you have a little bit more of subcutaneous fat, but look at these muscles comparing to the other side. They have all these white streaks within and interspersed the musculature. And again, for you that are in the audience right now learning, always look at the subcutaneous fat. The subcutaneous fat is white, so it's fat, white. So anywhere else that might have white within the muscles is also fat. So you have fat within your muscles, like Sean says so well, the marbling of your musculature. So this will progress to musculature atrophy or sarcopenia, which is when you don't have enough muscles to sustain your body. So how do you want, that's my question, how do you want to age? Do you want to age with muscles that you're going to be walking on your two legs as a miracle walking person? And, being able to stand up, being able to take a shower alone, being able to have fun and travel around wherever you want and play with your kids and grandkids? Or do you want to progressively have your muscles replaced by fat in a point that you might need a wheelchair, you might be on a nursing home, you might need people to take a shower, to give you a shower, you might fall and break your bones. And that's when we attack visceral fat. When we attack visceral fat, we are also attacking the ectopic fat, like the fat in these muscles, and you are building a more functional body. So then it's not about longevity in increasing number of years in your life. It's about if you are increasing number of years in your life, or even if you're not, since our days might be numbered, but like, how do you want, what is the quality, not the quantity, but what is the quality of life that you want for you? And that's the point that you have to fight visceral fat, because do you want to be able to take care of yourself, or do you want people taking care of yourself and you need an oxygen tank, or you are spending lots of money with medication and you're not being able to get a shower and you are on your diapers because your musculature from your pelvic area is not strong enough and you are with incontinence, urinary or fecal incontinence? How do you want to age? How unhealthy you want to be?
Right. Do you want normal aging, which is what's happening on the left?
Yes.
Right? Truly normal aging as our species was designed to do.
Yes.
Right? Outside of, rare events and, war and things like that. If we're eating largely a whole food diet, we have normal aging. We're not eating excess ultra processed calories. Or do you want abnormal aging, which is what we see? So many people, I'm surprised. So many people, when you ask them, hey, do you want to live to 90 or 100, or even in some cases beyond that? I've never heard so many individuals saying, no, I don't. And even young people, and you ask them why don't you want to live to that age? They said, I look around, whether it's my grandparents, my parents, whether it's friends' parents, or I go and visit at the nursing home or volunteer, I see people that are in their 60s, early 70s, mid 70s, 80s. And if they're lucky enough to still have their brain capacity and they don't have Alzheimer's or dementia, which is very scary, and my heart goes out to everybody who has that, they don't seem like they have a healthy aging. A lot of people are afraid of aging because they think of somebody who's frail. Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who's been on this podcast before, talks a lot about the importance of maintaining lean muscle mass, especially for women as they age. And she shared a statistic in her book and on the podcast that was mind-blowing. And I believe that statistic was of women above the age of 65 who end up falling, again, tying back to having a lot of intramuscular fat, osteoporosis, sarcopenia in the body. They end up falling because they don't have a strong body, right? Or they trip or something happens and they break their hip, something like 50% of them will never end up walking again,
Yep.
which is very scary to hear. And a big part of that I'm hearing you share is that how well your body is protected from that fall, whether or not you end up falling in the first place. And God forbid, there's plenty of reasons that we could all fall, even if you are healthy, how protective your body is in making sure that it protects the bones from breaking. A lot of that is all connected to how much visceral fat and intramuscular fat you have inside of the body. Is that accurate?
Yes. And exactly. You are extremely accurate. And see this about falling and breaking your hips and the mortality rate. If you would research that, the mortality rate after breaking a hip is extremely high. And see here, this is a CT, but again, I will teach you how to look at a CT too. So again, this is your skin. Beneath the skin, you have the subcutaneous fat. On the CT, the fat is gray. But again, if the subcutaneous fat is gray, everywhere else that has fat is going to be gray because it's fat, right? Same product, fat. But see this muscle? Again, this is the erector spinal muscle. You can see that this person barely has the erector spinal muscle. All this that is gray, it's fat, replacing the muscle. So how are you going to be able to walk and sustain your body standing up if the musculature that is supposed to be doing that is fat and wobbly? You're going to fall. You're going to break your bones. And that's what Dr. Gabriel teaches so well. Muscle mass. Muscle mass is important to keep your body functional and to keep your brain functional, because there has been lots of research showing that the muscle health is absolutely related to your brain health, as well as your gut muscle, your gut, your microbiome and your gut health is completely related to your brain health. So you have to fight visceral fat, improve your microbiome by fighting visceral fat, and improve your muscle and improve your brain. Because again, what is the purpose of living, like you were saying, what's the purpose of living until 90 or 100 or 80, but not even knowing who you are because you have dementia? And it's so sad for the person and it's so sad for the family. So how could we fight this? By fighting visceral fat as well.
We took a little break in terms of talking about causes, and I want to come back to that a little bit, right? You mentioned processed food. And I think when Dr. Sean Amaro was here on the podcast, one of the distinctions that we really wanted to share, because processed food can mean a lot of different things, right? It can mean, almonds that are ground up and now are almond butter, that's a processing that's there. It could be, whole avocados that are turned into guacamole. But really, to drive the message home, we're really talking about ultra-processed food.
Yes.
Ultra-processed foods, which are foods that have gone through multiple steps, are generally not a food that you could create that same level of processing in your house, right? And often have a lot of chemicals, preservatives, additives, and are adulterated in their normal whole food form to be hyper palatable.
Yes.
I mean, everybody knows the classic examples of potato chips, right? That's a perfect ultra processed food. Having a potato here and there, and potatoes actually by themselves score very high on satiety, like they're very satiating. When you add a lot of other things on top of them, sour cream, butter, processed different things like that, they become less satiating. But having a potato here and there is one thing. And generally speaking, try to get somebody to eat, 2 or 3 potatoes. But now take that potato, ultra process it, not just process it, ultra process it and make it a chip, right? You can crush an entire bag of potato chips, and that's going to be, it could be, thousands of calories inside of that ultra processed food. So what I really wanted to drive home, and please correct me, if I'm missing any angle of it, it's the hyper palatable, ultra processed foods in our diet that are so pervasive, from everything like, potatoes are the number one consumed vegetables here in America, primarily because of chips and fries, right? It's not that people are eating, straight potatoes. And tomatoes are also a highly consumed vegetable, not because people are eating them on their patty at McDonald's or somewhere, but because people are using them in ketchup and tomato sauce in pasta. So these types of hyper processed vegetables, and of course, in some cases, meats too, that are engineered to be something that we cannot stop eating, or have added levels of salt. The number one source of salt, people who have high blood pressure and are dealing with hypertension, they go to their doctor and their doctor will say, well, we need to take out sodium from your diet. People forget that the number one source of sodium and salt, not exactly the same thing, but generally correlated, is bread rolls and pastries and breads, processed breads, right? Not sourdough bread that you get from the local bakery, processed pastries, breads, bread rolls. That's the number one source of sodium and salt in our diet. So these are the ultra processed foods that, unfortunately, by the latest statistics, you have as part of our diet here in America, depending on the age group that you're looking at, it could be up to almost 70% of the total calories. Of course, sugar sweetened beverages fall into this category. You can have thousands of calories just by having, a few sugar sweetened beverages throughout the day. And these are the things that are, in turn, because of the concentration of calories, it's a lot of calories very quickly. And generally, they're refined carbohydrates, right? So it's another form of just a massive dose of sugar in your body. This combination and unhealthy fats, this is what's driving this explosion of visceral fat from a dietary perspective. Is that accurate?
I would say so. I would say that all this huge amount of calories that you just mentioned are all wasted calories, calories that you could just throw in the garbage because none of them are going to bring any nourishment to your body, right? So oils that are not beneficial to your body, like seeds and vegetable oils, canola oil, and the huge amount of sugar that is added to everything with different names. So I would say do your own research because sugar has lots of different names, right? And the pesticides from the vegetable that are in the vegetables, and the additives and preservatives and things that give color and taste. So these are the foods that you definitely should avoid
Or
because they are
greatly minimize.
or greatly minimize because these are the foods that are definitely feeding your visceral fat
Yeah.
and damaging the microbiome of your gut too. So I would say that I would say implementation of strategies for health should be according to how you feel comfortable and how you are not going to feel overwhelmed. Because if you feel overwhelmed, you're going to give up or you are adding stress as well, right? And we don't want to add stress because stress is always a feeding source to visceral fat. So look at the strategies for optimizing your health. Choose the ones that are easier to be implemented. Implement one at a time, and then stack another habit. And fruits and vegetables. There are controversial information. There is controversial information regarding fruits and vegetables, but I would say mainly because of having the preservatives and the pesticides, the pesticides. And I have been doing the strategies from Sean that he advocates for fermented vegetables and fruits, because either they are prebiotics, probiotics, and they are fiber for my microbiome, so they are making my gut healthier, but also because the process of fermentation ends up taking away the amount of sugar that would not be that would not be proper or good for the body, right? So
yeah, I know Dr. Sean is he's big on fermented foods, and we had a whole conversation about that.
Yes.
And there could be a lot of different ways that people choose to eat.
Yes.
And I think that part of this podcast is helping people separate, what matters and what doesn't.
Yes.
Also helping them understand that there's going to be a lot of variability. Some people don't do well with dairy, even though there might be types of dairy that actually could be very good for people, especially things like fermented, dairy like kefir. Even me, when I have fermented dairy and kefir, even if I have too much whey protein in a day, I get little tiny little blemishes and things. And probably that's because of my history of poor gut health as a kid, being on a lot of antibiotics for strep throat and other things. So there'll be a lot of different variation. And I think the thing for people to understand and notice is that generally speaking, if you're moving towards a whole foods diet, which again, if almost 70% of our foods here in America and increasingly in the Western world that's changing is coming from ultra processed foods, just moving to a whole food diet and then finding your personalization within that is going to be helping you move in the right direction. The challenge is a lot of people think that they're eating very healthy, but when they actually look at it and when they actually do, let's say a full metabolic workup and they get an MRI like this to look at their visceral fat, they actually realize that what they thought was healthy is not actually healthy, or it's not taking them to a place that is optimal. And that's why we're doing today's episode. Now, just high level, we talked about the dietary side of things, ultra processed foods, highly processed foods, fast foods, Doritos. And by the way, just so everybody's aware, these ultra processed foods, I don't want to, just go after fast food. There's plenty of ultra processed foods that are sold at Whole Foods Market and Trader Joe's because there's a lot of quote unquote healthy food that has been made hyper palatable. So it's really up to us to start to separate, what is actually genuinely healthy and should make up I don't like to use the word should, what can make up the base of our diet, whole foods that's out there, and then what other things are an occasional situation, right? I think sometimes when people hear podcasts and they hear about the dangers of refined carbohydrates and sugar, they think, okay, I can never eat those things. You can have them every so often. Now, just understand they're extremely addictive. They were designed to be that way. And the healthier you eat and the more that you monitor your metabolic health, you look at your fasting insulin, you look at your A1C, you look at your glucose, you look at your lipid breakdown, and you look at your visceral fat as well, the more you're going to be encouraged, because not only do you feel better, but you're going to see your blood work change, and you're going to also see your body composition change and your visceral fat reduce over a period of time if you so happen to be lucky enough to get a scan done.
Yes, I would say in the same line of thought that you are making your comments right now. Everything is moderation, right? You have to find what is comfortable for you in eating and exercising and walking, in sleeping patterns. You have to find what is comfortable and start from there with moderation, one change at a time, one step at a time, because becoming healthier, optimizing your health, it's really not a destination, it's a journey. So you have to walk, you have to do things that you are going to be able to sustain with commitment, consistency as a journey, because you're not going to say, oh, I got to where I want to be, because there will always be room to be better and better and improve your health better and better. So that's what I would say. Start with what is manageable. Start with what you believe it's sustainable. Start with connect, like I said, connect to your heart. What is the reason you want to become healthier?
What is your why?
What is your why? A deep, deep why. And when you connect to that, make a plan. And commit to yourself. You have to be the person. We as humans, we have basic needs. We need to feel loved. We need to feel seen, heard, valued, honored, respected. And who would be the best person to do this for you? You. Because you were born with you, you're going to die with you. So you are the person who needs to get your back. So love yourself, commit to yourself, find your why, and have compassion. Do your best at each day. And one step at a time, no criticism, no judgment, just do your best and keep doing, do not give up, just keep doing. Commitment, consistency, compassion, get your back.
Powerful message. Part of this show in helping people separate what matters and what doesn't is also helping them realize that diet is the foundation of so many things, right? We cannot, optimize every other area of our life and not pay attention to anything in our diet. And that being said, diet is not the only thing that's there. So when you were talking about visceral fat, we chatted a little bit about diet and the ultra processed foods, high amounts of refined carbohydrates that are linked to all sorts of conditions. We just did an entire episode on fatty liver disease with the top doctor at the Cleveland Clinic who has demonstrated that he can reverse, in most instances, except for super late stage, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, that they can reverse fatty liver disease by primarily what? Removing ultra processed foods, extremely cutting down on refined carbohydrates, getting in the right foods inside of the body and system, and improving the metabolic health. And then you see the liver heal. It's magic, but that's what the body is designed to do. So diet is important. And you started to mention that it's not just diet, especially when it comes to visceral fat. So one area you mentioned was stress. Another area that you mentioned was sleep, the importance of getting high quality sleep on a regular basis. And if you have something interfering with your sleep, like an undiagnosed sleep apnea or some sort of other issue, if you have a lot of a lot of blue light in the evening, that's disturbing your sleep. If you have a lot of stress that's impacting your sleep, giving your sleep the attention that it deserves, because improving your sleep is not just going to cut down cravings the next day. Because when you don't sleep well, you crave carbohydrates. That's been well documented, and you want to overeat as well. But also your body is more rested and can go through the repair process. So you have stress, you have sleep. We talked about diet. Is there anything else that you really want to highlight that are the root causes that are out there that are driving an explosion of visceral fat inside of the body?
I want to highlight something that you also said about the last podcast you have had with fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and all the things that you could do to reverse that are probably the similar things that you would do to reverse visceral fat, because they are both ectopic fat, inflammation fat, right? And how you said it was so awesome, because the most advanced you let it be in your body, the most you are exposed chronically to the ectopic fat, visceral fat, or fat in your liver and inflammation in your liver, the hardest it is to reverse. And it might not be reversible in the fact that the liver could develop cirrhosis, fibrosis, and then you would have a liver cancer because of that. So that's what it's so important. And that's where I get the anchor. That's what it's so important, that talking about visceral fat as the root cause of all these chronic diseases should be implemented in the medical school curriculum. And the people who are listening should research and really advocate for themselves with providers who would jump in and be their accountability partners, providers that they can trust with guidance and wisdom and knowledge, because you gotta work in the beginning stages where you can reverse, where you can build health, where you can build performance and a functional body, instead of letting it grow, and then you have cirrhosis, and then you have dementia, and then you have diabetes, and then you have like all these other complications because of visceral fat. I am not saying that if you have all these complications, you should not work on yourself, because all these things can get better. But if you are like a tofu, thin outside, fat inside, or if you have not developed these later complications, that's the point. That's the time for you to just take ownership of your health and follow the strategies and research and work on your body.
Part of what I'm hearing you say is that visceral fat is also, it could take decades for Alzheimer's to develop, right? But visceral fat, as being something that's connected to many chronic diseases, it's almost like the canary in the coal mine. You could be in your late teens, early 20s, mid 20s, early 30s, and you could start to see that you have a level of visceral fat that is abnormal. Everybody's going to have some visceral fat inside the body, but you're starting to get abnormal levels of visceral fat. And that could be the earliest almost smoke detector going off, an alarm saying, hey, something bad is happening in the body. We don't know exactly which way the body's going to say, ouch. Diabetes is one way that the body says, ouch. Type 2 diabetes primarily. Type 1 is a little bit different, obviously, autoimmune condition. Heart disease is one way the body says, ouch. Alzheimer's disease is one way that the body says ouch.
Yes.
But before all those things say ouch, there is often, in most cases,
the silent killer.
The silent killer that's building decades ahead of time, which is visceral fat.
Yes.
Let's continue down the imagery of some of the slides that you've prepared for our audience today to really drive home this narrative again of visceral fat. What slide would you like to go into next from your presentation?
So I would like to say, if any of you have done a CT or an MRI in the past, you go to your clinic where you had the scan and just ask for a copy in a CD, and you can come home and open the CD in your computer, and I'm going to teach you now how to see your own visceral fat. I'm not going to teach you how to be a radiologist because you need training for that to be a doctor, but I'm going to teach you to see the visceral fat. It's simple, it's fast, it's easy, it's effective. I would tell you, sit down, because you're going to be very not well surprised. I have been reading scans for 30 years. I am a doctor for 30 years. I am a radiologist for 26 years. And since I got my attention on towards visceral fat, at least 95% of the reports I give daily are with lots of visceral fat, moderate to severe visceral fat. So do not be alarmed, or do not be alarmed and also be alarmed if you have lots of visceral fat.
Both pay attention, but also understand that your health journey is a byproduct of a larger societal issue.
Yes.
We live in, unfortunately, this society that is the perfect storm to fatten us up in the wrong way, right? So you're not alone.
Yes.
It's not your fault. And yet you can do something about it.
Exactly.
This is what you're here to share with people.
Yes.
This new approach, which you, your company, your team, and many other experts that have come on this podcast are championing, which is keeping insulin top of mind, not making insulin the enemy, but understanding its role. And then let's say the traditional approach of calories in and calories out. Largely, following a lot of the same people that you follow, my understanding of things has been that, hey, if you constrict calories and you really watch every single calorie you eat, even if you're eating a lot of processed foods, you will lose weight, right? If you are to the T monitoring each calorie and setting a deficit, being in calorie deficit. And as we see that that's been the advice, tracking every calorie to the T is extremely difficult. I've done it before as I've been part of a very intense sort of workout regimen. And I'm so grateful for the experience that I had. It's not something that most people are going to do. It's not sustainable for people long-term, but it does work. Now, the other side of it is this idea that if you keep insulin top of mind, that, you understand its role in sort of making you hungry, how it distributes weight inside of the body. But the area that I've always been a little bit kind of confused about, and maybe you could shine a light on it. Are you saying that if calories are, let's say, able to be managed for an individual, right? They're at a little bit above what their baseline is. So they're having some excess level of calories. Are you saying that if they are eating foods that are not putting them on this insulin roller coaster and glucose roller coaster throughout the day, that they wouldn't gain weight? Or is the idea that, hey, if you are eating in this way where you're keeping insulin in mind and paying attention to it, that you are just not going to crave a lot of the things and continue to overeat in a way that causes you to seek foods that will increase the weight gain in your body? Does that make sense? And it could be some hybrid of those two, but I'd love to get your thoughts on it.
That's such a great question. And I'm going to do my best to answer it. And if I don't answer it as specifically as you want, please let me know. But when we're talking about calories, we have to recognize that it's not just caloric density and how they impact insulin that matters for weight loss. So it also matters how do they drive eating behavior, because different calories, different types of calories will make you want to eat more, and different types of calories will make you want to eat less. So let's take protein, for example. Protein will trigger your satiety hormones. It makes you feel full. When you have like a chicken breast for a meal, for example, It's not like you often say, oh man, I could have 2 more chicken breasts because of all the protein. But if you have a cupcake at the end of the meal, it's very likely that you're like, oh, I just want to go back for a little bit more and a little bit more. And so that's because the starches and the sugars in the cupcake, that spikes the pleasure center in your brain. It activates the pleasure center in your brain, and it triggers you, it activates you to want more food, and specifically want more sweet food. It wants that reward. But if you have protein, that doesn't happen. And so like these GLP-1 agonists, like semaglutide, that's what it does. It essentially mimics the effect of protein. It increases that GLP-1 or mimics it and makes you want to eat less. So when we're talking about like, well, can you eat a bunch of calories and not gain weight? You might be able to, depending on the calories that you're eating. But the opposite is also true. So for women who are like, I feel like I hardly eat anything, and anything that I do eat just like sticks to my body, how can I weigh so much when I eat so little? The foods that they're eating are likely the ones that are spiking insulin and driving all of those nutrients into fat storage, versus eating a high protein, high healthy fat diet, high fiber diet that helps you feel more satiated. The other thing about fats too is fats will also trigger those satiety hormones similar to protein. Fiber will cause stomach stretching, essentially, that can signal feelings of fullness. So we have to pay attention to how do different types of calories impact eating behavior and reward behavior, and recognize that if you're having, 200 calories of walnuts, you're going to be a lot more satiated than if you had 200 calories from a piece of chocolate cake. And you're going to be less likely to then overeat at the next meal. So I think in the long run, you can eat a small amount of calories and still have a weight problem if those calories are spiking insulin. You can eat slightly more than your baseline from a calorie standpoint, especially if those calories are coming from protein. You're going to be able to maintain your weight. The other thing that we didn't really talk about yet is how different, like how much energy different types of calories need to break down. So the thermogenic effect of food, essentially. And protein has the highest amount. So if you're eating 100 calories of protein, your body is not assimilating all 100 calories. It's actually using quite a bit of that energy to break the protein down, get it to where it needs to go. So that's another distinction between like the calorie model and then going a little bit deeper is how does your body use those calories? How do those calories impact your brain and subsequent eating behaviors?
Yeah, that's super important. We're not lab rats who have control feeding. We're living in the real world. And so we have to take into account so that even though if you eat excess calories, you will gain weight regardless of what source it's from. But if you eat whole food diet and with these tips that you and your team talk about, which we're going to get into in a second, you're going to put yourself in a position, if I'm hearing correctly, where you're just not going to feel hungry as much. And also for a lot of people that I've seen, even if you think you're eating very little, a lot of these sugary foods also tend to be sugar, fat, and they're highly processed. And many people don't actually know how many calories are there. It's so easy to take a few potato chips, then eat the whole bag, even if they're cooked in avocado oil, by the way, right?
Yep.
And end up in a place where you eat the entire bag and not realize that you just crushed 2,000 calories in that one snack. So it doesn't seem like a lot of food, but you just had so much in a concentrated situation of hyper palatable foods that didn't leave you satiated.
Exactly. And I think that if people were to actually measure out a serving size of things, they would be shocked to say, oh my gosh, like I'm way overeating and I didn't know it. But yeah, when you're eating nutrients that make you feel full, it's easier to maintain an energy deficit over time to lose weight.
Well, you said something important, and we're just going to keep on returning back to this as a core concept in the interview. You said, losing weight is straightforward, but my goal is to help you keep that weight off for the rest of your life. So now that we've established a little bit of some of the building blocks, and there's others that we're going to come back to because there's a lot in this topic that's here, I just want to give some tips to the audience that's there. What have you found, especially for the demographic that would be listening to our podcast episode today? Largely it's probably 75% women who are, 40 plus demographic, and they're thinking about making these tips practical, what are some of the top tips of keeping that weight off for the rest of your life so that it feels like this is something that not only that you can do, but you look forward to doing?
Yeah. So the first is protein. I'm coaching someone right now who's been following a ketogenic diet for a while and probably has 10 grams of protein a day. So she's just eating a ton of vegetables. Yeah. Eating a lot of vegetables, thinking that she's eating healthy. And I'm like, oh boy, we have some work to do here. So a protein goal is 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight. So if you want to weigh, and ideal is not like what's realistic for you. Because if someone's 250 pounds, their ideal weight in their mind might be like 170 pounds, but that's still not an ideal body weight for your height. So that's really the only time I recommend using the BMI chart, the body mass index chart. Pull up like BMI chart online and then go to the healthy zone for your weight and pick a weight. And then that's kind of your protein estimate. So I'm 5'8". A good protein goal for me is like 130 to 140 pounds, or grams of protein a day. So it depends on your height, but that's kind of the ultimate goal is 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight. Now breaking that down, because I'm sure a lot of women are like, I'm way under eating protein. The first stepping stone towards that goal is at least 30 grams of high quality protein a meal. And the reason that it needs to be a high quality source is to get that minimum dose of leucine, which is an essential amino acid required for muscle growth and support. And so 30 grams of protein really isn't that difficult to attain. A lot of women are close to that, but they're not quite getting it. So they might be eating like 2 eggs for breakfast. And maybe it's bumping it up to 3 with some, breakfast meat on the side, or like for lunch day, I had 5 eggs with some cheese. That gets me to the 30 gram of protein threshold. Well, that's another reason why you see a lot of protein supplements have like 30 grams per serving size, that they know that that's needed for muscle health. Now, why I suggest starting with a protein recommendation is it makes everything else easier. So protein and water are really the 2 dietary places that I recommend starting, because if you're adequately hydrated and if you're eating enough protein, you will naturally have fewer sugar cravings and be more satiated, and it's going to be easier to maintain a caloric deficit over time. So the other thing is water, and I am shocked. I'm shocked how many people are underhydrating their bodies. So we recommend, a good baseline is about 100 ounces a day. I think for most people, that's probably more than what they're doing, but half your body weight in ounces of water a day at a very minimum. So if you're, 200 pounds, again, that's 100 ounces of water a day. So those would be the first 2 recommendations. If you want to lose weight and keep it off, you have to be hydrated and you have to adequately dose your protein. And there was a really interesting research study that came out that compared like a very low calorie diet, a ketogenic diet, a lower carb diet, a high protein diet. And they looked at where did the weight loss come from? Did it come from muscle mass or did it come from fat mass? And the results were astounding. Like a high protein diet preserved the most lean muscle mass during weight loss. So when we're losing weight, we want to preserve that muscle mass because, again, it's metabolically active and it helps you with insulin sensitivity. So the more muscle you can have as you lose weight, the more likely it's going to be to stay off. And that's why I have such huge problems with diet programs like Nutrisystem or Optavia or Weight Watchers who have no emphasis on protein, or just why you take like people taking GLP-1 agonists like semaglutide kills their appetite completely. Great, you lose all this weight, but you've lost so much muscle mass and the weight is going to come back on with a vengeance now. So those would be the 2 biggest dietary tips. And then from there, I think adding some fiber into your diet is great. About 25 grams a day for women, 35 for men. Fiber is kind of a controversial issue. I think carnivore is such a hot topic right now, but I personally eat fiber. I recommend fiber. I think that there's some benefits. So adding some fiber, but from foods that are lower in starches and sugars. And that's kind of the caveat. Like a lot of people think of fiber And they think of starchier foods like whole grain breads or whatever, but you can get a lot of good fiber from low starch and sugar foods. And that way you're really minimizing the blood sugar and the insulin response from those fibrous foods. So that's a little bit of a dietary approach to weight loss, to long-term weight loss. I'm happy to go into more
Yeah, before we go into more, I think it's worthwhile to talk a little about these diet tips that you suggested. And the first part of it that I want to emphasize for the audience is you have a very specific methodology, and your approach to sustained weight loss is actually, in the beginning, it's about adding in, and it's about doing more habits that themselves may not make you think that I'm eating less, but they're going to put you into a situation that it's a lot more sustainable, and you're going to find yourself hungry less often. There's some people, not right or wrong, they both work, but the challenge is what's more sustainable, which is your approach that will have you focus on just eating less or immediately moving to, cutting out ultra processed foods, which in general is a good idea. But I love your approach as I started to get more familiar with it, because it's about adding in things, right? Do you want to expand on that any further about why that's such a central part of your message and your business and your company?
Yeah, well, we run an online course to reverse insulin resistance, and the fuel module alone has over 200 references. I have read so much. I have read research. I've read books, but a huge part of weight loss maintenance is psychology. And so from a behavior change standpoint, if you're asking someone to go from A to Z and completely change their lifestyle, it won't stick. And so from a behavior change standpoint, I really follow the science. And the science says adding in things is a more sustainable solution than completely cutting things out in the long run. Yeah, cutting things out is going to get you faster results. I'm not here to argue that point. But again, that's just shifting our beliefs from what's better, fast results or long-term results? I believe long-term results. The other thing is we incorporate a lot of behavior change strategies into our program. So we have a Zivley habit hierarchy, and we talk a lot about mindset first. So when we're talking about adding things in, let's talk about some more things that we want to add in. We want to add in a daily mindset routine. We want to add in a weekly meeting for self-accountability, and we want to add in a good night's sleep. So mindset, meetings, the accountability, sleep, water, and protein. Those are going to be the major things that we focus on first before, reducing the net carbs or reducing the sugar. And people come into the program, they're always like, oh, I've already reduced my carbs. I'm like, okay, good. Let's not forget about these other foundational habits. So that's kind of what we build on. And then from there, we talk about intermittent fasting. From there, we talk about how do we strategically exercise? How do we incorporate more whole foods? But if we don't have this foundation of mindset and sleep, everything else is so much harder. So I like to describe it as dominoes. Like you're stacking up these healthy habits like dominoes so that the subsequent dominoes fall easier. So on the subject of adding in, I just wanted to start to expand this conversation and bring in more lifestyle factors besides just nutrition.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that in a second. I'm just going to ask you a few more things on the nutrition side, because for a lot of people, these tips that you're saying that are well documented, we've had individuals like Donald Lehman on the podcast, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who's also been on your podcast as well too, which we'll link to in the show notes, and many others talking about the research around protein. We've had Dr. E on the podcast, and he has a satiety app called Hava where they do a bunch of different things, and they've talked about fiber and protein being so important for satiety. And, naturally in this world that we live in, a lot of people have different messages that are out there. One of the ones, I don't know if you saw this recently that came up. This article was floating around the web in the last week, right? This article, which for those that are not watching on YouTube, is from Vox, Vox.com. And the title is, "You're probably eating way too much protein." And the subtitle is, "Americans are obsessing over protein and forgetting about fiber." Now, the interesting thing is that I think that you and I would both agree that a lot of people are forgetting about fiber, and fiber is an important thing. I will link to the article in the show notes that are there. But whether it's this, and you can read all the details and the recommendations and them citing different governmental, organizations saying that, we shouldn't be shooting for that 1 gram of protein for ideal body weight, that actually a lot of experts out there say that we should be looking at, 0.33 grams of protein, for our daily needs that are there. So if people want to read it, we'll put it in the show notes. You can check it out. But the reason that I bring this up is that, as you can imagine, those individuals that are watching us right now on YouTube, listening to us on the podcast, and are feeling in alignment with what you're sharing are also saying, well, I've been hearing different things, or I was watching Netflix and I saw the vegan twin study and they're talking about how important, just wanted to get a chance for you. How do you, as an individual who's deep in this space, look at the conflicting advice that individuals are getting? And how did you arrive to this place of feeling strong in not only your own recommendations, but the lifestyle you follow with the gram per pound of ideal body weight for protein?
Oh, I did watch that Netflix documentary, and I was just like, I fast forwarded to the end. I'm like, I don't need to see all this in between stuff just to show me what they said the results were. Well, they looked at LDL. Like, they're not looking at the right numbers to interpret the meaningful, like the effectiveness of the intervention. So they're like, oh, your LDL went down. Like, this is a good sign. And I'm like, LDL cholesterol means nothing. Like, total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, they're in Dr. Robert Lustig's works, they're garbage. And so I think what I would have liked to see is, like, did they look at ApoB? Did they look at LDL particle number? Did they look at fasting insulin, which I don't think that they did. So I think that we're looking at the wrong outcomes, and we're giving too much weight to outdated information. So if you're prescribed it, like I always just say this on interviews, if your doctor prescribed you a statin based solely on total cholesterol or LDL numbers, please go read Dr. Robert Lustig's book, Metabolical. It's a great explanation of LDL particle number. So I think for me, gosh, you're right. I mean, it was years of going down research rabbit holes. You read, and you're like, okay, well, this is conflicting with that. So what's my litmus test? Who's my mentor in this space? And so the first thing that I really established was, who do I trust? Who do I really trust knows what they're talking about? And a few people, just to kind of throw them out there, Dr. Jason Fung, Dr. Robert Lustig, Dr. Peter Attia. Like, those be my 3 kind of go-to people on metabolic health issues. And so if I ever had a question, I would go to their stuff and I would say, well, what does Dr. Fung say about this? What does, Dr. Lustig say about this? What does Dr. Attia say about this? And then I would read their opinions and thoughts and whatnot. But then the other thing I thought was very helpful was to have that litmus test of insulin and inflammation. And so how does something impact my insulin? That's very important to me. But a lot of studies, just mainstream stuff like that, I don't know if they're looking at that. And it's not like, I think that that's a headline. Like, we were talking about that a little bit earlier. It's like, people love to take extremes because extremes are clickbait. And people are like, oh, am I getting too much protein? Oh, am I forgetting fiber? And it's like, it doesn't have to be that dramatic. It's not that hard to reach your protein and reach your fiber goals. And we can all coexist in the same arena without having such extreme opinions just to get clicks on a video or on an article. So I think from a research standpoint, the other thing that I looked at was the longevity studies, because a lot of dietary studies are only like 8 weeks long, a year long max. And I wanted to look at, okay, well, what does an older adult need? Because my end game as a geriatric physical therapist is to help somebody age well, prevent diabetes, prevent heart disease, prevent sarcopenia. What is the dietary approach that we need then? And how can we start to incorporate more of that now? And so when that article is like, well, 0.33 grams or whatever they said, I'm thinking, yeah, that might be enough to survive, but that's not my goal. I want to thrive and I want to prevent disease. So I always had that lens of disease prevention and long-term weight loss in mind as I'm combing through each and every book or article or opinion piece. I hope that answered your question.
No, it absolutely does. And a lot of these people in this space, you mentioned a few, some of them even have, one in particular, I think Peter Attia, he's kind of come on the other side of the fence of, and has shared some of his thoughts about hey, actually, I do think that LDL is still, matters on a population level that are there. And I think the thing is this, is that for most people, if you just focus on the basics and you double down on the basics, which are largely the things that you're talking about over here, you're going to be in a better shape than like 99% of the population. And a lot of these little nuances, the technology is getting better and better. I come from a background and a family where I have familial hypercholesterolemia. And then just in the last couple of years, my cardiologist that I got connected to through Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, Michael Twyman, there's a new test that's out there, and it actually can look at, it's an advanced CT scan that looks at actually soft plaque in the heart. It's called Clearly, no affiliation. I went in to do it because I was like, my LDL, and especially since I've been eating more of a clean paleo diet, has gone up, and my ApoB is quite high. So I want to know, do I have a lot of soft plaque that's there? Now, this test is like $2,000, and then you need a doctor to interpret it. I think Clearly is now doing some direct-to-consumer things, so you can see it on their website and you can order it directly. But I went and had it done, and to both my cardiologists, he wouldn't be surprised because I live a low-stress lifestyle. I don't have, alcohol on a regular basis. I didn't really drink alcohol at all, kind of, growing up, and I'm not doing a lot of things that I think probably contribute to poor endothelial health, but are maybe hotly debated. Like I stay away from a lot of the refined fats, even though I know that's a very, controversial topic for a lot of people. Are seed oils inflammatory? Are they not? I've made the decision to pretty much eliminate them, from my diet because I just feel, better that way. And, both my cardiologist and also there's a vegan cardiologist who was on this podcast who I sent my results to, and he went over them on the podcast, Dr. Joel Kahn. They both had shared that my results was the best they ever seen. Now, in Joel's case, he said, your results are second best. My results were actually better than you. So you're probably doing some things right. I'm probably doing some things right. And I thought, okay, at least I got, a partial win that was there. So all this is to say is that, if we focus on the basics, which are what you're talking about over here, and the things that actually help keep sustained weight loss, which is really the goal, and improved body composition.
Yes.
I don't remember which guest it was, but they were like, look, you want to lose weight? Go chop off a foot. You'll lose weight, right? Immediately you'll weigh less. We all know that doesn't make sense, and we don't want to do that. What we want healthy body composition transformation. We want more muscle, less fat that's there in general based on our population. And we want to keep it that way for a sustained period of time in a way that doesn't make eating the primary focus of our entire life. And that's the plan that you've put together. Now, before we get into, some of the other lifestyle areas that impact insulin, wanted to give you an opportunity for anything else you want to add in, but also just a couple tips on fiber. Are there amounts that you are telling your audience and the people that following your program to shoot for? And how are you getting in the target amounts of fiber in your diet? What are your favorite ways to do that?
Good questions. So anything else I want to share on the nutrition standpoint? I'm not including fasting in this conversation.
Yeah.
But like the fuel module of our course is like 2 hours and 40 minutes of me talking about macronutrients. So I don't want to go like too deep, but I think it's really important to help people understand carbohydrates a little bit better and fats a little bit better, and that a carb is not a carb and a fat is not a fat. And so there's 3 main types of carbohydrates: starches, sugars, fiber. And a lot of people are a little bit naive when it comes to starches. And they're like, oh, I'm not having any added sugar, and so I'm eating healthy. But I'm like, well, not all sugar is sweet. And so for breaking down sugar, there's 3 simple sugars. There's galactose, glucose, fructose. Then those combine to make slightly larger molecules. So sucrose is table sugar. That's glucose plus fructose. Lactose is sugar found in milk. That's galactose plus glucose. All of those are just, simple sugars. And then if people are like, well, is it a simple carb or a complex carb? That depends on if there's fiber involved in the food matrix. So when we're talking about starches, there's 2 kinds of starches because a starch is not a starch. There's amylose and there's amylopectin. So amylose starches are going to be like the rice, the barley, the quinoa, the more complex types of starches, the darker starches like sweet potatoes. And amylose is like a straight chain. So if you think of like a stick, a wooden stick, and there's two ends. And so those enzymes can chew up the glucose molecules, only two ends at a time, and it releases the glucose slower into your bloodstream. Compare that to amylopectin that looks like a tree branch. So there's multiple places where the enzymes can chew up the glucose and it's released faster into the bloodstream. That's from like white rice, white bread, white pasta. So I don't want people to come away from this interview with such a dogmatic mindset. They're like, oh gosh, I have to go keto, or I can't have carbs anymore. I need to go carnivore. You can include carbohydrates in your diet and still live a low insulin lifestyle. But I want you to do it strategically and understand that it's not just the fiber content in a starchy food that matters for blood sugar control. It's also just the type of starch in general. Is it amylose, straight, or is it amylopectin, branched? So the more whole food, obviously, the starch is, the better it's going to be. But again, the exception there is like rice and potatoes. So like a simple solution is make your mashed potatoes ahead of time. Put them in the refrigerator. Take them out on Thanksgiving. That actually helps some of the amylopectin starch convert into amylose starch and slow the blood sugar release. Another thing that you can do is just have the starches at the end of the meal. So if you have your fiber, like if you have a salad first, for example, or maybe some non-starchy veggies, and then your protein, and then have the sweet potato or the barley or the quinoa at the end of the meal, that's going to have a slower blood sugar response. If you go for a walk after you eat, that's going to help reduce the blood sugar spike. So I think those little tips, like a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar and some water before a higher carb meal, that's fine. So I really want to encourage people that there's blood sugar hacks that you can use when you do choose to have a higher carb meal. Now, in general, I typically recommend 30 grams of net carbs per meal at a max. For me personally, on a continuous glucose monitor, that's the level where if I go over that and I don't walk after the meal or I haven't exercised before the meal, my blood sugar response is going to be higher than optimal, which according to Levels Health is about 30 milligrams per deciliter. So if I'm starting my baseline at 90 before a meal, I don't really want to go above 120. And Levels Health has another parameter where it's like, what's like the max spike in general that they want? And it's like 110 to 115. That's really, really tight blood sugar regulation, even for me, and I'm metabolically healthy. So in general, I think we want to be paying attention to those numbers and recognize that the American Diabetes Association goal of like, it should be less than 140 2 hours after you eat is ridiculous. Like that is not optimal blood sugar management. So I think a lot of people are being given false hope by the American Diabetes Association guidelines on blood sugar management. And a lot of people can empower themselves through a continuous glucose monitor to see how do different nutrients impact my blood sugar. Because again, that's the byproduct of your insulin. So that's one big thing. I wanted people to understand carbs and then fats from a fat standpoint.
Can I mention one thing on the carb side? Just to highlight something that you mentioned earlier, another tip that allows you to get away with having more carbohydrates in your diet. And I went through this experience myself and you talked about it earlier. Add more lean muscle. You add more lean muscle. Muscle is highly metabolically active. And I went through a situation where I was training more intensely and I never really grew up training and lifting weights. And in that process, my trainer said, listen, I want you to add some more carbs that are there. You're working out. We're working out like 4 days a week. We're doing strength training. You have very specific goals that you want to get to for strength. And as we're on that way, you need to, repair your glycogen stores. And so I need you to have a little bit more carbs. And initially, I'm not an expert in this space like you are. I was just like, I don't know. I've had carbs in the past and I'm an investor in Levels and I've worn continuous glucose monitors and I regularly get my fasting insulin measured. And I was like, I'm not sure. When I eat too many carbs, I don't feel good. He's like, something is happening to your body now. You're adding every month, you're adding about 0.8 to a pound of lean muscle mass because we're on this program. You're meeting your protein goals, but because we are very active, you're feeling a little gassed. right? You're running out of energy. And so your strength is going to start plateauing a little bit. And you will find that you can have some more carbohydrates in your diet. I'm not eating these pharmacological doses and drinking, a liter of sugar sweetened beverages. We're talking about a little rice, a little oatmeal, things like that. And not only did I incorporate it and find that my strength increased because of restoring those glycogen stores, but I actually found that over a period of time of about 9 months of adding about almost 10 pounds of lean muscle mass, my fasting insulin improved in that time period because I had the benefits of just having that extra muscle as somebody who previously was one of the, skinny fat individuals that was out there that didn't have a lot of muscle. So again, just connecting all the dots for my audience here on things that you've shared, that we don't have to demonize certain things. Yes, we want to stay away from these pharmacological dosages of refined carbohydrates and sugar that is out there that a lot of people are eating, but you can still incorporate some of those things when you practice some of the tips that you mentioned.
People have been struggling with their whole lives. So it used to be you read, what's called a fad diet book. So Atkins or Sugar Busters or the Ornish book or South Beach or Protein Power, and you'd go on that diet. It might work, it might not. You'd stay on it for a while, lose some weight, and then go to see your doctor, and your doctor say, oh, well, you're eating too much fat, you're killing yourself, we got to get you off that diet. Or you'd lose 40, 50 pounds, then you'd go back to eating the way you always did, and then you'd gain the weight back. And there was no real way to break this thing out of the world of fad diet doctors. But what the internet has done is it's allowed people struggling with their weight and their blood sugar status and their blood pressure to go on the internet and look for answers. And then you could try the answers. One thing journalists like myself and Nina Teicholz in particular have done is, when I started writing about this 20 years ago, the idea was these low carb, high fat diets would kill you because of the saturated fat content. So we were all afraid if we did these diets, you would just keel over from a coronary within, weeks of starting, and everybody would laugh that you were on Atkins, and that would be the end of it. Over the course of 20 years, Nina and I, physicians like Mark Hyman and David Ludwig, and have pointed out that the research has consistently shown that this way of eating is very safe. Probably safer than the way the American Heart Association has been recommending us to eat, depending on how you define safety. It certainly makes people healthier. So we have a whole world of people who are now trying this way of eating, restricting carbohydrates to lower their insulin levels. And among that whole world of people are a lot of doctors, a lot of physicians. I estimate at least a few tens of thousands of physicians who were also struggling with their weight, or just got tired of watching their patients struggle with their weight and convincing themselves that their patients refused to follow their advice, and instead started asking, maybe my advice is wrong. So part of what's happening is you get pushback from the establishment, and that's just part of the job, part of what you have to accept when you imply that people have made mistakes. But along with this pushback, there's a world of people out there who are clearly benefiting from basically restricting the carbohydrates in their diets rather than trying to eat less, just trying to eat less carbs, fewer carbs, to be grammatically correct.
Thank you for that. Let's talk origin story, because you've written about it a little bit before. You've shared it on podcasts. What even got you interested in this subject to begin with, that you wanted to explore this topic? As you mentioned, your training was originally, going down the pathway of physics. Pick up the story from there and share with our audience, if you would.
Well, my first two books were just by chance, were about scientists, physicists, and chemists and nuclear chemists who discovered non-existent phenomena. So I did these sort of intensive investigations of scientists who had screwed up, and I became obsessed with this issue of how hard it is to do good science. how hard it is to get the right answer and how easy it is to screw up and how rigorous research has to be before it can be believed, before you can believe its results. This sort of endless process of hypothesis and test and test and test and replication. And so that was what my journalism focused on. It wasn't all I wrote about, but whenever I got a chance, I would dive into that subject and I did series of investigations over the years. And by the late 1990s, I stumbled into the nutrition field by accident. And I was interviewing a scientist, a researcher, I'm not going to call him a scientist, who was clearly one of the 5 worst scientists I've ever interviewed in my life. And yet, he took credit for putting Americans not just on the low salt diet everyone was eating in the late 1990s, and many people are still eating, but on a low fat diet. And I literally got off the phone with him. I was writing about salt at the time, which is why I was interviewing him. But when he took credit for the sort of low fat dogma as well, in the late 1990s, the definition of a healthy diet was a diet that was low in salt and low in fat. When he took credit for it, I called up my editor and I said, look, one of the 5 worst scientists I've ever interviewed. And I thought I had interviewed some of the worst scientists in the world in my earlier books. This guy was clearly down there. And I said, he just took credit for getting us on the low fat dogma. So when I'm done writing about salt, I'm going to write about fat, which I did. I wrote 2 investigative pieces for journal Science. One, the first on salt, the second on this idea that high saturated fat diets cause heart disease. This was 1998 and 2000. The evidence for both of them was terrible. You would never believe these hypotheses were true if you didn't believe it before you did the experimental tests. And while I was doing the dietary fat story, I was interviewing an administrator from the National Institutes of Health. I remember we were having a coffee at a Starbucks in Potomac, Maryland. And he said to me, when we put the whole world on a low-fat diet back in the 1980s, we really didn't know if it would affect cholesterol and heart disease that much because that evidence was very wishy-washy, iffy. But we figured if nothing else, people would lose weight because fat is the densest calories in the diet. And lo and behold, they stopped eating fat, they shifted to eating carbs, and we triggered an obesity epidemic. And I thought, well, that's an interesting thought. So after I finished the dietary fat story, I pitched this article to the to the New York Times Magazine on the origins of the obesity epidemic, always with that NIH administrator's words in my head that what happened was so in the 1960s, the idea was that carbohydrates were inherently fattening. And then we decided that dietary fat causes heart disease. And if you want to avoid fat, you have to eat carbohydrates and replace it with carbohydrates. So carbohydrates went from being something that most women thought of as fattening to heart-healthy diet foods. And the food industry was told to produce as much low-fat food products as they could. So when you take a fat out of a product, it becomes kind of tasteless. So often what you had is a kind of yogurts, the iconic example. You remove the fat from yogurt and you replace that fat with sugar or high fructose corn syrup, which is a form of sugar. And then you can advertise it as a heart-healthy diet food because it's got, say, 10 fewer calories per serving and it's low fat, right? But now it's high sugar, which it wasn't originally. So that's the kind of phenomenon that I've been, spent 5 years writing my first book on and then have been, working on ever since.
So you were mentioning your colleagues a little bit before, and a few of you all work together, some of the names that you've mentioned and some that you didn't get a chance to mention, on a review paper that was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition just earlier in September 13th, actually. And the title is The Carbohydrate Insulin Model, a Physiological Perspective on the Obesity Pandemic. What was your collective goal as a group with publishing this review paper at this time?
Okay, so one of the problems with challenging the conventional wisdom is it's a little bit of you've got, well, roughly in obesity science, I'd say you've got 150 to 200 papers coming out every week that's relevant to the subject of obesity. And some huge proportion of those are dependent on this sort of conventional thinking about the problem that's an energy balance disorder. And so you get this constant repetition in the literature, and when the media picks up these articles, that obesity is a problem of eating too much and expending too little. And it's sort of it's the problem. You never wanted your science to get to the point where it accepts a hypothesis that hasn't been well tested, because then it gets harder and harder to dislodge. Along the way, as various individuals in our world have started arguing that this is just wrong, and that there's this carbohydrate insulin model is a much more functional hypothesis to describe what's happening with this in obesity. You create sort of diehard researchers who consider it their obligation to prove that you're wrong, or at least to make it look like you're wrong. And so you start getting articles published that the carbohydrate insulin model is incorrect, it's been disproven in experiments, or the evidence against it is weak. So it's actually harder to publish an article establishing or even discussing the theory in a unbiased way than it is to publish an article claiming that the hypothesis is just wrong. So Professor David Ludwig at Harvard, he's a professor in the School of Medicine as well as the School of Public Health. He ran the pediatric obesity clinic at Harvard, the Boston Children's Hospital, for several decades. David has been one of the 2 or 3 leading proponents of this idea that obesity is driven by, it's a hormonal regulatory disorder. And again, I'm speaking for David. I hope I'm getting this right. But David believed that we had to get a major paper out there laying out what the experiments do and do not show, laying out what the thinking on this hypothesis really is, sort of fully reviewing the subject, both the theoretical and experimental sides, so people could see this without the bias that comes from only reading the articles from its opponents. And in doing this, David also, so he wrote the first draft of this article, but then he recruited some very influential co-authors, so 15 other academic researchers, among the most influential in the world on the subjects of nutrition and obesity, who agree that this hypothesis is most likely right, that the energy balance hypothesis or model is something of a failed paradigm, and gave their input into the paper, helped write it in subsequent drafts and get it out there so we could make a statement that this is a serious issue. It's a hypothesis that has to be taken seriously. If it's right, then there are definite implications for how we treat and prevent obesity and this slow motion disaster of these epidemics. And, sort of whenever we could get this out was the right time to do it, because these epidemics are not going away. While the medical community has made some recent advances in drug treatment for obesity, you're not going to put, or I hope they're not going to put the 100 or 150, probably 100 million obese individuals in America on drug therapy. If they can solve this issue by changes in diet and lifestyle, the correct changes.
You talked about, reviewing some of the base science and experiments that were conducted on both sides of the equation, right? The energy balance model, and then also looking at things on the carbohydrate insulin model. Is there one or two anecdotes that stands out from that paper that you all as a team put out together and worked on that you feel really highlights this point that the idea of it's all just calories in and calories out is not the complete story or picture. Was there one or two anecdotes that were inside of the paper that you can talk about?
Well, we didn't really use anecdotes because, again, it's the nature of scientific publications to avoid them at all costs. But I think the point, remember when I said earlier, there prior to the 1930s, there are these two competing hypotheses. One is people put on fat because they eat too much. And the other is this idea that you have a sort of constitutional hormonal predisposition to accumulate excess fat that's triggered by the environment. And the way you would test this in animal models, we didn't have animal models of obesity until the late 1930s, when sort of the obesity can become an experimental science. And in these animal models, what would happen is often there are various ways you can make an animal obese. You can lesion the ventral medial hypothalamus of its brain. You can do genetic manipulations. You can do dietary manipulations. And often when these animals are growing obese, they eat a lot. The technical term is they become hyperphagic. And so it was natural for obesity researchers to blame their obesity on this hyperphagia, this eating too much. So that whatever you do to the animal surgically or genetically or through diet, it makes the animal eat too much, and then the animal gets fat. And that's, to this one, the main obesity research community, that's proof that obesity is an eating disorder, that it's a taking in too many calories problem. What they rarely thought to do was to ask the question, what happens to these animals when you don't let it overeat? So you measure how much the animal's eating, say, before the surgery, and that's all you let it eat after the surgery, or you take an animal that's got a genetic mutation to make it obese, and you feed it, say, half the calories that you would feed a lean animal. So you literally semi-starve it. And in all these cases, the animals get, if not obese, they get fatter anyway. So the 8th grade science 101 terminology would be you control for overeating and the animals still get obese. There are experiments out there, famous experiments out there, where the animals are literally semi-starved. Like I said, you measure exactly how much a lean animal's eating, and you feed your animal that you've manipulated to become obese half of those calories. So you never let it have a decent meal, and it gets obese anyway. And that is pretty much a refutation of the idea that they get fat because they eat too much. I mean, these people, when they think about it, they go, oh, if we're starving them, then something about the manipulation must make them expend too little calories. But the flip side is whatever you've done to these animals is causing what's called a change in fuel partitioning. So instead of the problem being how much they eat and exercise, the problem is, how much food they consume. It's what they do with the food they consume and what that food does to the hormonal physiological regulation of fat accumulation. And so those are the kinds of experiments that are discussed that are, clear evidence, at least in animals, that obesity in animal models is not an intake problem. It's a fuel partitioning problem. They're partitioning calories into fat rather than using them as energy, which is ideally the reason why they're eating.
And on the contrasting side of the carbohydrate insulin model, which is everything that you've been sharing over the years, what is one experiment that is worth noting here to talk about how that idea is so much stronger of a model to understand why we're all getting obese?
One experiment?
Yeah. Is there an experiment that comes to mind? Any of the work of Dr. Ludwig's? Anything over the years that you've written about?
Yeah, one of the things I've done along the way was after I wrote my second book on this subject, I co-founded a not-for-profit called the Nutrition Science Initiative. We had support from Texas philanthropists to fund studies that could ideally resolve this question. One of the issues with science, when you're trying to establish which of these hypotheses are correct, is that, does the fat accumulation occur because of this? You've created an imbalance in intake and expenditure, or does the fat accumulation occur because you've created a hormonal imbalance that's driving fat accumulation? It takes very rigorously well-designed experiments, and so we funded 2 that could address this. One that was a pilot study that was at a collaboration between researchers at Columbia University and NIH and Pennington, which I mentioned, and the Clinical Research Institute in Florida, and the other was run by David Ludwig at Harvard. And the idea is, just like in the animal experiments, one thing you can fix in an experiment is how much food people eat. So you have this interesting system where they're expending energy in response to how much food they're eating and how much they weigh. And you can't really fix how much they're expending, and you can try and fix how much they weigh, but that's surprisingly difficult to do. But you can fix exactly how much they eat. And so again, this sort of 8th grade, basic science, fix one variable, and then design an experiment in which the 2 hypotheses would make different predictions. So in the simplest way to think about it, you say establish how much energy your subjects are expending on a standard American diet, and then you give them exactly that many calories of a diet that maximally lowers insulin. So that's a ketogenic diet. So let's say, for example, you have I'm a big guy, so I might expend 3,000 calories a day if I was eating, sort of the way most Americans eat. So you measure that, and there are ways to do that. They're tricky, and it's easy to make mistakes, but there are ways to do it. And so you measure the energy expended, and then you feed me exactly 3,000 calories a day of a diet that manipulates insulin levels, a ketogenic diet. And now you have 2 hypotheses that make predictions. The energy balance prediction says, well, we're feeding you the same amount of calories, and your weight is determined by the difference between intake and expenditure. We have no reason to think your expenditure is going to change, particularly if we feed you the same amount of protein on both diets. So if you do this experiment, we don't expect to see any difference in weight, whether on the ketogenic diet or the carb-rich standard American diet. And this hormonal regulatory disorder says, well, if we maximally lower insulin levels, that means fat is going to be mobilized from the fat tissue, and it's going to be oxidized for fuel. And there's no law of physics that says that the amount of energy you expend can't go up. So our hypothesis says that if you maximally lower insulin, you're going to see weight loss. And that weight loss will have to coincide with an increase in energy expenditure. So we can measure that as well and see if we see that. So the nature of science, we funded 2 experiments to do variations on that experiment. One saw an effect. They measured energy expend. They only looked at energy expenditure, expecting to ask the question, does it go up or not when you switch to a ketogenic diet? And they measured it by 2 different mechanisms. And one, they saw a small effect that they thought was transient, and the other, they saw a large effect. Nonetheless, they interpreted this as not convincing enough to them to believe the carbohydrate insulin model. And then the other experiment was done by David Ludwig at Harvard, and David had 3 levels of carb consumption in his study. And as carb consumption went down, energy expended went up, consistent with this idea that as carbs go down, you get more and more mobilization of fat from fat cells more fat being burnt for fuel and so more energy being produced. Ideally, we'd have kept funding studies, but by that point, our Texas philanthropists were not wowed by the quality of our organizational skills. And I had books to write, so the not-for-profit has been somewhat in hibernation since about 2017.
Connect the dots fully with where we started off the interview, that insulin and the hormonal idea, the carbohydrate hormonal idea of weight gain. Connect the dots fully and just help people understand who are still trying to wrap their heads. Maybe they're watching this on YouTube or they're listening to this because a friend sent it to them. They're not as well versed in this world as maybe as maybe I am, or definitely you are, who writes about this topic. What are the things that people are eating on a regular basis that are a huge part of our diet today? We all know the term carbohydrates, but let's get a little bit more granular. What is making up our diets that is causing our hormones, in particular our insulin, to be out of whack, creating a whole milieu of problems that lead to the signaling to store excess weight in the body?
It's interesting just listening to you talk about it. There's a lot of technical terminology. I've just talked about a complicated experiment. We talked about the carbohydrate insulin model and the energy balance model. The carbohydrate insulin model, when it comes down to it, it can be captured by the idea that carbohydrates are fattening. Okay, carbohydrate-rich foods are fattening. Sugar, grains, starches, primarily sugary beverages, beer. The major source of calories are carbohydrates. These foods stimulate secretion of the hormone insulin. And insulin, we think of insulin as a hormone that controls blood sugar. It's the hormone that's either deficient or dysregulated in diabetes. Physicians think of insulin as a hormone that controls blood sugar. But one way it controls your blood sugar is by telling your fat tissue to store fat. So basically, it's like an orchestra, a conductor in an orchestra, and after you eat, it's orchestrating what you're going to do with all the different macronutrients you've consumed. So the macronutrients are protein, carbohydrates, and fats. Carbohydrates get into your blood sugar, into your circulation as glucose. They raise blood sugar levels. Blood sugar is blood glucose, and high levels of blood sugar can be toxic. Are toxic to cells. So your body works very hard to keep your blood sugar under control. And one way it does that is insulin tells your tissues, your muscles, and your organs to burn the glucose. As the glucose is rising, the insulin is like shoveling it into the cells to make sure that to do its best to keep blood sugar under control. And as it's doing that, it's also signaling the fat cells to take up any fat from the diet and any fat in the circulation and store that, because the primary job is burning insulin. Protein is being used to rebuild cells and tissues, so that's got a job of its own, and insulin is orchestrating that as well, with other hormones as well. So when insulin is secreted, you're storing fat. That's what you're doing. You're burning carbohydrates and storing fat. And we secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbohydrates in our diet, or the carbohydrates converted, the glucose converted from protein. But what we're interested here is the carb content. And like I said, there had always been, for at least 150 years, the conventional wisdom was that carbohydrates are fattening. I quote an article in pretty much all my books that was written in 1963 by one of the two leading British dietitians in the British Journal of Nutrition. And the first sentence is, every woman knows that carbohydrates are fattening. Because that's what every woman thought she knew in the early 1960s. So this is a hypothesis. There's a very good hormonal explanation for it. And arguably, if it's hard to understand why it's so challenging to the researchers to understand this. I mean, they'll say, well, because it's wrong, but assuming it's not. But yeah, so that's it. Sugar, starches, grains, sugary beverages, carby beverages like beer. By this thinking, even something like milk can be fattening, and because of the lactose content of carbohydrate, which makes up more than 50% of the calories. And those of us who fatten easily, for many of us, it's not enough to just give up the more obvious sources, the sweets, the sugary beverages, the beer. For many of us, when you look at insulin dynamics, fat tissue is very sensitive to the hormone insulin. The phrase used by metabolism researchers when I interviewed them for my books was that fat tissue is exquisitely sensitive to insulin. It's the most insulin sensitive tissue in the body. So you have to, for most of us, if we want to get fat out of our fat tissue, we have to minimize the insulin on our circulation. And that's when diets like the ketogenic diets, what was called Atkins in my youth, come into play. Because those are just diets that replace virtually all of the carbohydrates with fat.
There's been an explosion in companies and people who are not diabetics using things like continuous glucose monitors to keep track of their glucose and understand how their different dietary choices are impacting them. I wear one, and it's been really helpful to see that even sometimes a lot of the foods that I thought were really healthy that I was eating in the world of wellness that are still primarily carbohydrates that are super refined, like tapioca and cassava. Those have a much higher and lasting glucose response for me than even just eating, straight up bread and other things like that.
Don't tell me this, by the way, because my kids they opened a boba store, was opened down on the main drag about a third of a mile from here. So my kids religiously now get boba tea, and they come back and they say, "But I get it without sugar, Dad." And there are these tapioca balls in it. Have you ever seen this stuff?
Yeah, I have.
I mean, I just don't get it. I realize it's a generational thing. I don't know. They're vile to me, but it does. It's just, it's another way to drink carbohydrates. And if we're right, this is a problem.
That's well said, right? If you're right, this is a problem. And I think that one of the great thing about continuous glucose monitors is that you could see in real time, and you can see the impact that it has to you as things accumulate, especially when you are not in an optimal range. So I was just going to get your opinion on those, whether you find them helpful, whether you ever used one, whether you recommend them to people, when it comes to getting a better understanding of how food continuously can either be supporting you or maybe working against you.
Yeah, I have experimented with CGMs, and they're fascinating, and I recommend anyone do it. They're not too expensive to get even without a prescription. Because I already eat a ketogenic diet, I do not eat that many foods that raise my blood sugar. So for me, it was interesting, but not as interesting as it could be, because my blood sugar is pretty much flatlined. For other people eating mixed diets of any kind, I think it could be revelatory to see what these foods are doing to your blood sugar and to see how much blood sugar fluctuation there is. Even in those of us who are healthy and showing no signs of diabetes, and yet our blood sugar can be going up and down by the 50 points, hourly, dependent on our snacks. And it's going to be different for everyone. So that's why the CGMs, these continuous glucose monitors, are so useful.
In your last book that you published, you were on Mark's podcast for it. You guys had a great interview. We'll link to it, The Case for Keto. Inside there, you share on this topic of people eating sort of like mixed diets. You say that for some people, carbohydrate abstinence needs to be approached the same way that we approach addictions we need to break. Talk a little bit more about that. For people that are still in this place where they haven't gone that, direction of significantly swapping out the calories in their diet that primarily are coming from these refined carbohydrates. How is it important to think, and why is it important to think of it like an addiction?
Well, it's just, and this, my last book, I interviewed 120 plus physicians who have sort of converted to this way of thinking to get their feelings about the risks and benefits to their patients and the challenges. And many of them said to me that they thought of what they did not as sort of treating obesity, but as treating carbohydrate addiction. We can be pretty confident from the clinical trials, and there are going on 200 of them now, that people will improve their health by removing these carbohydrate-rich foods from their diets. And this seems to be pretty much universal in the clinical trials. Not saying there might not be other ways to achieve the same benefits, but this is pretty much the case. So then the question becomes, why is it people find it so difficult to do? Many people, the idea of giving up their bread is like back when I was a smoker. I used to think, I can't live without cigarettes. And so a lot of people, there are foods that they will rationalize eating endlessly because they don't want to give them up, and it constitutes their source of joy in their diets. And I understand that completely. But if you think of this as an addiction, it's a way to get around that problem. And then you say, look, let's just take 2 months, do an experiment, take 3 months, ideally. You can live without bread for 3 months. You could live without your morning orange juice for 3 months. You could live without, the cherries you have at lunch or the donut you have at 10 in the morning when your coworkers bring in donuts and you can't say no to them. Treat it. See what happens, or go 1 month, then go day by day, but do the diet right, eat correctly, give up, and then see how you feel, because you may find that after a month, what you thought you couldn't eat is, you don't really miss, and the benefits to your health. It's funny, I just did a podcast for Stat that'll come out in a couple days, and they asked me if I could do it with somebody I knew who had gone through this, sort of struggled with their weight and then, tried a low carb or ketogenic diet. So I asked this young man that I met doing this research. I met him when he was a student at Yale, a law student at Yale. He invited me to come speak to the food and nutrition group at Yale Law School. And when I came, he told me a story, which was that he weighed 400 pounds when he was 18 years old. And he had been morbidly obese his whole youth. And his father had actually seeing how much he had struggled with his weight and how he didn't eat any more than his lean friends did. He swam, he boxed, he couldn't stop himself from becoming morbidly obese. His morbid obesity runs in the mother's side of his family. And then his father enticed him to try Atkins, basically gave him a copy of my 2002 New York Times Magazine story, and he lost 170 pounds. And when the editor, the Stat editor who was moderating said, but, people say this is unsustainable. And my friend said, well, the people who say that didn't have to wake up every morning and be 400 pounds, and I did, and now I don't. And that to me is sustainable. And that to me is a really powerful message. So people, they think, well, I can't give up my bread, and if I do, it's not going to make that much of a difference. But they don't think in terms, if I do this right, maybe I could be the person who no longer has to wake up at 300 pounds, but can wake up at 180 or 150. And when I do, I might have a different attitude towards what foods I'm willing to eat. I just read an article this morning about a young woman who had endometriosis, terrible periods, painful periods, and she tried everything. And she used to think in terms of low carb, high fat diets being fads. Keto was a fad, but she convinced herself to try it for a month. Just like you might say, I'm going to quit smoking for a month, or I'm going to quit drinking for a month. I'm not going to eat carbohydrates for a month. And after about 15 days, she had a period that caught her by surprise because there was no pain that came first, no cramps. And she was like, this is crazy. And then the gist of the article was, yeah, maybe keto is a fad diet, but she's never going back because she doesn't have to wake up with endometriosis anymore. Just like my friend doesn't have to wake up and be 400 pounds. And that's a powerful, motivator to break an addiction.
The connection of protein, muscle synthesis, longevity, and that whole conversation. Give us a review, because I don't think still people understand how important protein is to muscle and how important muscle is to longevity.
Yeah. So it's important to understand right up front that the body regulates protein, how we make proteins, protein synthesis in different tissues in different ways. In our organs, we make proteins in the middle of the night when we're not eating. We have to, or we'll die. If the liver doesn't continue doing its thing, at 3 a.m, you die. Muscle only makes protein after meals. And what we found out in the last 20 years, and not necessarily my research, but others, is that as we get older, the efficiency of how we use protein goes down. So where a 15-gram meal of protein may have a fairly reasonable effect on muscle protein synthesis in a 25-year-old, it'll have almost no effect on a 65-year-old. But what people at Galveston, Bob Wolf, and Doug Patton-Jones and others have found is that if we double the protein, if we increase the protein quantity and quality up into the 30s or even 40s, the older individual can respond just like the younger individual. And what we know is with the aging curve, there tends to be a decreasing amount of muscle mass. We lose mobility, we lose metabolic regulation, and Dr. Gabrielle Line and I talk about this all the time. We lose those metabolic functions, and so it's very important that we do things to try and protect muscle as we age. Resistance exercise in general is probably the number one issue, but the number one is keeping your protein correct, keeping it high and keeping it high quality. So those two things are really important to the aging process to help us maintain body composition, functional mobility, our ability to metabolize carbohydrates and lipids, just everything about how the body runs. Gabrielle and I always talk about, muscle-centric health. Basically, if your muscles are healthy, you've got a pretty good chance of a good, long life, healthy life.
We've done a lot of episodes on the topic of metabolic health, and in particular, the importance of being insulin sensitive and what happens to people when they become insulin resistant. And a lot of individuals who listen to our podcast know that there's a big conversation around making sure, in the context, of course, of overall calories, that we're very mindful about the total carbohydrate load that we put on our body, especially processed sugars, refined flours. The next leap of that to your work is that, well, muscle is a big part of that. Can you connect the dots there? You talked about a big picture, but I just really want to make sure that that connection is known in the context of today's conversation.
Yeah. So, how much carbohydrates do we use, or do we need, and how do we use them? We know that the body needs approximately 70 to 80 grams of glucose, blood sugar, per day to run the brain, red blood cells, kidney. There are tissues that are absolute users of blood glucose, of sugar. The dietary guidelines people have put a safety margin on that, so we have an RDA of 130 grams per day. The average American is eating a little over 300 grams. So we're eating 3 times that. And so then the question is, where does it go? I mentioned the obligatory tissues, the brain and the red blood cells, but then beyond that, what else can use it? Really, muscle or adipose tissue. We can either burn it with exercise, or we can store it as fat. And so the question is, how do we balance those things? We've worked a lot on thinking about that and trying to figure out the amounts. We basically came up with the numbers, and I could go through how we did it, but basically glycogen storage, gluconeogenesis, muscle use, et cetera, we said that you can use about 35 to 40 grams of glucose at a meal before it requires really high insulin values to get it to store. And when you start doing that, you shut down muscle's ability to burn fat. That begins to disrupt your blood lipids, and it also triggers the adipose tissue and liver to start making fats out of it. So a lot of people will argue that, well, you get fat and that creates insulin resistance, that you have too many fatty acids around and that inhibits insulin and glucose use, but it's actually the other way around. Insulin actually creates insulin resistance. The higher the insulin gets after your meal, the more insensitive your body gets, because glucose is actually quite toxic. It actually has its own disease. It's called diabetes. If you have too much blood sugar and it lasts too long, you damage basically every organ in the body, diabetes.
So linking that back to muscle, is it fair to say then that this is another reason why, especially as we get older, when people become more susceptible naturally through the aging process to these chronic diseases like diabetes and Alzheimer's disease, et cetera, that do seem to have a link into overall sugar that's being consumed in the body and refined carbohydrates, maintaining and keeping your muscle mass, and in some cases growing it if you're under-muscled, is an important part of staying insulin sensitive, because muscles are one of the key mechanisms to use up that free-floating glucose inside of the body.
Exactly. And my long-winded explanation, muscle is really your only flexible user of glucose. The other things are all set, and that gives you a number of around 100 grams per day. As I said, people are eating 300. That means to use that with muscle, that means every individual needs to have 3 hours of intense exercise every day to use that much carbohydrate. If you don't have it, it has to get stored. And, where can you store it? People say, well, you store it in glycogen. But if you're already carbohydrate full, those stores are already full. The only thing left to do is make it into fat.
This is a topic that I'm personally very attached to talking about on the podcast, because I come from a South Asian background. I'm Indian, and a lot of Indians in North America, and also Indians now in India who are adopting the Western diet and all the principles that come along with it. Our population set seems to have a little bit of a predisposition towards insulin resistance. And you have a group of people, especially in North America, that are typically professionals, right? So they're sitting at a desk often, and they also don't have a culture necessarily. Like I really didn't grow up seeing my parents work out besides playing like some sports and things like that. There was no history of, strength training inside of our, community and things like that. Now there's starting to be that revolution, which is really beautiful to see. And you have a lot of individuals that fall into the category of skinny fat. On the outside, they look like they are kind of a normal body weight, but then they typically have a lot of abdomen fat, that adipose tissue that's there. And many of them are suffering from, diabetes, and many of them end up with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. In fact, Stanford University has a whole department that's dedicated to just looking at heart attack risk for the South Asian population, because out of any ethnic minority here in the United States, they have the highest risk of cardiovascular disease, but their lifestyle seems to be highly promoting all the things that we know that don't work. Especially growing up, I was vegetarian. So you're tending to undereat on protein, which we'll talk about here in a second. You're sitting a lot. You're getting a lot of your calories from carbohydrates. It's like, if we want to induce cardiovascular risk, if we want to induce diabetes, that sounds like a perfect recipe to be able to do so.
Yeah, you mentioned home country, India. India is one of the fastest populations, in terms of growing the epidemic of diabetes, and it's exactly the term you described as skinny fat. They don't look overweight as many Americans, do, and I think it's a good example that one of the things Dr. Lyons and I like to talk about is that is obesity the cause of other things, or is it a symptom of a metabolic error? And we like to think of it as a symptom, that the insulin abnormalities, the metabolic dysregulation is occurring, and that leads to us accumulating weight. And so if we can shift around to focusing on muscle health, we can correct the problem, and that'll help us avoid the issue of obesity. And, we always talk about the issue of, people have been studying obesity since I was in grad school, so 40 years or more, and we still, in fact, it's getting worse. And Dr. Lyon and I always talk about they've got the wrong target. The target isn't adipose tissue. That's the pathology of the problem. The issue is if you want to correct it, you need to focus on muscle.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And even for somebody who was in the world of wellness, not as a researcher, not as a clinician, just as sort of what I call a professional amateur, like I like to read, I like to study, I like to listen from people, but by no means an expert. And I'm always the first to say that. I was very confused about the topic of protein because I was hearing a lot of different mixed messages about things. And I really do credit, Dr. Lyon and then her putting me onto your work as being a big shift. And not that this podcast is about me, but I always like to share my journey with the listeners. So August of last year, I also just came back from a big trip to Italy where I took my family. I was celebrating my 40th birthday, and I got serious because I was turning 40 about wanting to really look at how under muscle I was. So I am on the leaner side. I was vegetarian during some of the biggest growth spurts that I had in my body, and I never really built up a solid layer of muscle. And I always had to fight so hard being on a plant-based diet, not that it can't be done, we'll chat more about that, to get any kind of gains that were there. So when I weighed in and did a body composition through caliber testing with the group that I was working out with here in Los Angeles, I came in at 26% body fat. And I am not a heavy individual, and most people who would look at me wouldn't think that my body fat percentage would be that high. And really what it was is I wasn't so fat, I was just under muscled, and that was causing a big situation where fat was really running the show instead of muscle being a big part of it. I'm big on glucose monitoring. I also track my insulin resistance and my fasting insulin. And not that I had any issues in that category, but I also saw by adding on lean muscle mass, which I added on about 8 pounds since that time period. And I've dropped my body composition now to about 12.4%. Working out with this group over here and adding more high quality protein, again, based on your recommendations, I've seen a whole shift that's happened in how I feel, how I perform. And it's kind of crazy once you apply all these things into your life, how quickly things can change. So I'm not asking you to react to that. I just wanted to share and really actually give you and Dr. Lyon kudos for being a big part of how I've been shifting my health more recently.
I appreciate the comments, and it certainly makes us feel good to be able to provide that kind of information. And frankly, it's a story that we hear all the time. And I said earlier, it's one thing to be vegetarian when you're 25 or 30, but it's quite a different thing to be vegetarian when you're 50 or 60. One of the things we know is that, as I mentioned earlier, your efficiency of protein use goes down, but your calorie needs go down a lot too. So probably by 30% from your 20s to your 60s or 70s. And so that means you have to have a lot higher quality diet. You have to have more nutrients and fewer calories. So that's really an important issue. A couple of things you mentioned that I think a little history for me
Please.
Might be useful to you. We talk a lot about adults and aging. As I get older, I think more about it. The issue for me first started back when I was early in my career, and I did some work in Northern Africa, and we were looking at malnutrition. And so getting back to your story, one of the things we discovered is that if children on very poor quality protein diets, and I won't use the word vegetarian, but low protein, poor quality diets don't develop muscle mass. And we looked at that in animals and also in children. And if they don't develop the muscle mass early, it kind of predestines them to be skinny fat, to be over fat, because it's very hard to develop the muscle later. We know that there are kind of periods of time where muscle cell development is much more rapid. And if you don't do that, the number of cells you have will tend to be lower. You can make the cells larger, hypertrophy, but the hyperplastic growth tends to be limited. So that's a real risk. And people, I worry about the movement toward plant-based diets as mothers think they're doing a good thing and they're pushing their children toward plant-based diets. If they in fact stunt their growth during those early periods, those children are going to pay for that in their 50s and 60s. And so I really worry about, we don't have the right information. Mothers aren't getting the right perspective on this. And things that they will do in their own personal diet, they probably shouldn't apply to their 1-year-old or their 2-year-old or their 5-year-old. And so I really worry about those kinds of messages right now.
Yeah, it's so true. And on the flip side, again, there's so much to pack about your work, but just while we're on this discussion topic, when I was, eating a vegetarian and later a vegan diet, and you would see these anecdotal stories of people who were really great at building, like vegan bodybuilders, right? And it always gave you hope that if you just did it right. And of course, strength training is a huge part of the equation. We're going to chat about that in a second. But one of the thoughts that I had is just from my observations, when I would see individuals who started vegan or vegetarian from a young age and then continued that all the way into, like, let's say their mid-20s and, adulthood, I noticed a significant difference between those individuals versus, let's say, somebody who grew up eating meat and probably getting higher quality protein in their diet and then choosing at, their mid-20s or 30s now to go vegan. It almost seemed like it was easier for them to maintain the muscle that they had already built up versus, somebody who was vegetarian and vegan getting gains and looking like they were like a professional athlete. Is that something that you've seen?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in life between like 20 and 40, we sort of have this honeymoon period of life where you can kind of abuse your body in lots of different ways and you're still fairly healthy. But if you do that when you're, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's a lasting impact. And the problem with that is the children can't make that choice. It's imposed upon them either because of socioeconomic, environmental issues or family concerns,
religious issues.
And then it catches up with us again at the other end of life when we get into our 60s, 70s, and 80s. It catches up. So, and a lot of people hear some of the things I say and say, well, you can be vegetarian. You can, but it always requires more knowledge. You have to understand proteins. You have to understand how to make complementary proteins. And you have to have the resources to do that. And you're going to have more total protein and more total calories to pull it off. So, it's not that it can't be done, but the average American doesn't have the food knowledge or skills to do that. If you go out and survey the average American doesn't even know where carbohydrates come from. So it's a big step to go from what's wrong with the American diet to, okay, let's make everyone vegetarian and that'll solve it all. That's not the solution.
Like a lot of wellness podcasts, my audience is, probably majority women. And you've been very vocal about why this topic is so important for women in particular. Can you chat a little bit more about that as regard to women's total protein consumption based on the data that we know from different surveys and things that are out there, and how, in particular, with a lot of the goals that maybe women have with body composition and weight loss, protein plays a central role in helping them achieve those goals?
Yeah. Women, for social issues, body shape, appearances, society imposes different pressures on women, and they tend to be more sensitive to body shape and what they're eating than a lot of men do. What we know from the national surveys is that women in general are fairly close to the minimum RDA. The average for the entire population in the US is around 70 grams per day, which is above the RDA. But if you start looking at subgroups of women over 60, 40% are below the minimum RDA. That's why women have a big issue with sarcopenia and muscle aging issues. Of women under 20, I think it's not quite 30, it's like 28% are below the RDA. So at the two extremes, women are eating extremely low protein diets. And quality comes into that. If you're going to be that low, all of the data, one of the things to keep in mind is all of the data for defining the RDA was done with high quality animal protein. It wasn't done with wheat. It was done with dairy or eggs. And so what we think of the RDA is based on having 100% animal protein. So again, it's a very low bar, and at the two ends of the aging extreme for women, they're eating below that bar, so they're at risk.
Yeah, and it's worth digging into the RDA, and I've heard you talk about it on many podcasts that are out there. Peter Attia and Simon Hill and Jason from Mind Body Green and things. But it's worth touching on that because this is an area that a lot of people get confused, and they still see different sides arguing for different things. So there was a clip that I had where Dr. Gabrielle Lyon was on this podcast, and we clipped it out for social media because we thought it was very interesting, and it went super viral. I think it has like 10 million views now. It's kind of crazy. And she was talking about, the RDA and a little bit of the history on the RDA. And I'll let you explain it a little bit. But then in the comments, one of the prominent comments that was there was a gentleman, I'm forgetting his name, but I believe he's been on Joe Rogan before. He's a vegetarian athlete and MMA fighter. I'm forgetting his name again. And then he came in and said, no, the RDA is like exactly where we should be around. And so people are confused. So give us a little bit of a history of the RDA and how we came to some of those numbers.
Back in around 1900, even before we knew all of the amino acids, animal scientists had to figure out how to feed animals to get them to grow. And so they developed various ways of, well, if we fed this, we can measure growth, or we fed this, we can measure nitrogen accumulation. Those were techniques we had back then. And so protein has traditionally been measured by nitrogen accumulation. That works pretty well in kids or young animals because they're growing. They're actually accumulating. But if you're talking about a 45-year-old adult who's in maintenance, basically they're not accumulating any new protein. They're replacing proteins, but basically they're stable. That's a very poor technique to measure your requirement based on accumulation of something you're not actually accumulating. So the issue of not the measurement of the RDA has historically been based on short-term, about 7-day nitrogen balance techniques, where they basically lower the protein intake down till your intake and your excretion, urine, etc., are equal. Everybody knows that grossly underestimates the actual protein requirement. Everybody does that. And the RDA is based on making that number and then putting a 2 standard deviation above it. And by definition, what that means is that 97% of the people shouldn't show any deficiency, but 3% will actually show frank deficiency at the RDA. That's the definition. Okay. That data was also all done with 20-year-old college students, 25-year-old college males. So the definition is healthy young males eating high quality protein. That's what the definition is. So 75% of Americans are overweight, so they're not healthy. They're not physically active. 50% aren't male. I mean, you kind of go on and on. The RDA is a very low bar at the end. 2002, the National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine said, well, that's not adequate. For every nutrient, we know there's a range of intake going from the RDA, which is the bare minimum, up to some upper limit. And so people have sort of been testing that for vitamin C and vitamin D and zinc and things like that. For protein, we don't have a really clear range, but we know it's near somewhere around 3 grams per kg. Something above a gram per pound. And so we have a range from the minimum RDA 0.36 grams per pound up to at least 1 gram per pound. Where you want to be in that can be a personal choice, but age, physical activity, type of diet all makes a difference in that choice. The worst case scenario would be a 70-year-old who chooses to be sedentary, who chooses to have a plant-based diet. That's the worst possible set of circumstances because you have everything going against you.
And about how much muscle loss is happening just as a byproduct of aging when we're not hitting those protein requirements?
Yeah, the estimates, sort of not with any routine exercise or protein choices, the routine average is usually said to be around 8% per decade.
8% per decade, starting at a particular age?
Around 40.
Around 40. So you hit 40.
We seem to peak both muscle mass and lean body mass and bone mass all seem to peak sort of around 40. So I mentioned earlier, we kind of have this honeymoon period from end of growth around 20 to 40. You can kind of abuse your body with a lot of different things in that period, and it all seems to work pretty well. But once you start getting beyond 40, now you have natural aging going against you, efficiency's going down, your calorie needs are going down. You need to make some adjustments, and most people don't.
We had on a really great practitioner and advocate who first became known for some of her viral talks on fasting. Her name is Cynthia Thurlow, and she's a nurse practitioner background. And we had her on recently to talk about her updated views, and especially in the context of where she is in her life. Probably, I think she's in her later 40s, maybe early 50s. I can't remember exact age. And she was saying how fasting was a big part of her healing journey in the beginning to help her. But now at the age that she's at, she is very careful and mindful to not do, longer fasts, like a 24-hour or more fast, because her central concern is losing muscle mass. And she's fought so hard with her protein. She's also a good friend of Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who's been influential in her work. She's fought so hard.
Heard me say that, in fact.
So she's probably heard you say that on that. And it really just brought up this larger question of how you see fasting in the context of all your work and what we know with longevity, with muscle, how important muscle is. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think you explained it pretty much the way I would think about it. During our between 20 and 40, that honeymoon period, people who do fasts, you'll lose weight, but generally you'll gain it back, and you'll gain it back. You can gain the muscle back. Fasting when you're early in life, that's a permanent loss of muscle, a failure to develop muscle cells. Fasting later in life, we know that in a fast, and you can think about it in terms of weight loss, you can lose about maximum of 2 pounds of fat per week in a fast that would be fast. Everything above that has to be lean tissue. You just can't account for the calories any other way. And so in a fast, that might last multiple days, 4, 5, 6 days or something, 50% of the weight loss will be lean tissue. And it may very well be mostly muscle tissue, certainly the further you get into it. And we know that once you get beyond 40, your ability to regain that goes down dramatically. And the older you get, the worse it gets. Back when we first started doing our weight loss studies, so that's almost 20 years ago, the early 2000s, there was a general thinking in the aging world. So we had the issue of obesity and aging, and people were arguing, should 65, 70-year-olds ever actually try and lose weight because they lose so much muscle mass that they can never regain? Is it worse? Are they worse off for the muscle loss or for the fat loss? What's the balance there? And so, I think what has happened in the last 20 years is we now know that if you try and restrict calories, but do it with resistance exercise and protein, our research has shown that you can restrict that muscle mass loss down to like 5% or less. So you can make it almost exclusively fat loss. Where if you just go in and do a high carbohydrate diet, I'm going to restrict calories, I'm going to lose weight, no real exercise addition, somewhere around 35% or more will be muscle loss. And that can't be regained. That's a real risk. And that's why women frequently, we talk about yo-yo dieting, and women are a little more prone to it than men. They'll try different diets and they'll lose some weight and then they'll gain it back. And that yo-yo dieting progressively makes them have less lean body mass.
So especially if somebody's trying to lose weight and improve their body composition, and a lot of my audience probably is in that category of 40 above, we have to keep in mind, based on where you're coming from, if I'm hearing you correctly, is if you don't have strength training and appropriate levels of protein, we're going to get into what's, appropriate, you are going to be losing muscle, which again is going to come back to all these other things. It's going to make you more insulin resistant. It's going to increase your likelihood of, hip fracture and falls, things like that, because of lack of grip strength, right? We know the connection between longevity and grip strength, and all the other downstream effects that are there. That's what I'm hearing from you.
Yeah, exactly. I have frequently said and thought from early in my career that when we design diets, we should always have two tissues in mind. How can we keep muscle healthy, and how can we keep the brain healthy? Everything else in the body is regulatory. Everything else will adapt to what you eat. But those two tissues have specific needs, and we need to keep those healthy. Whether we're talking about sleep or mental acuity or Alzheimer's, or whether we're talking about muscle function and daily mobility or insulin sensitivity or even blood lipids, those two tissues regulate everything.
One more question on this muscle loss that comes along with people losing weight. This seems to be one of the things that is also related to this hot topic today, which are these, drugs like Ozempic, right? People are losing weight, but it does seem that they're losing muscle mass as a part of this. Have you followed this at all? And do you have any comments on it?
No, I have not. I feel like I've sort of superficially looked at that. So I have no real expertise, so I won't wade very far into it. But, all of these kinds of drugs, Ozempics or rapamycin for long-term longevity or so, all of these kinds of drugs really worry me. You're using a drug which will have multiple effects in the body, most of which have never been studied for really long term, to basically mask a metabolic problem. I find it really objectionable. But again, I am not an expert in it, so I'll leave it at that. But philosophically, I'm enormously bothered as a biochemist by thinking about that.
Let's go back to protein. Now, one of the other reasons that it became quite popular in the plant-based world to sort of deprioritize protein, and there are individuals that are out there that are now coming out that are plant-based saying, no, protein is actually very important. Yes, we do have to work harder. And they're coming from that angle and they're acknowledging that it is more difficult. And then they have their arguments as to still why they think it's worthwhile, right? But they're not deprioritizing protein. But talking about the world, that plant-based world that I kind of grew up in, that said, you don't really need protein. Look at a cow, look at a gorilla. I've told so many people in the past the same sort of story, not being an expert, like, yeah, look at a gorilla. How does it get its protein? How does it get so strong? Oh, actually, that's a great thing for you to expand on first before I continue forward. How is it that a gorilla or a cow or a rhino gets so big and strong? What's the difference between them and human beings?
I have no clue. My understanding is a gorilla eats something like 50 or 60 pounds of food per day or something. So they have, enormous capacity for eating a lot of food that we can't eat or digest very well. I'm not an expert in the gorilla digestive tract, so I'll stay away from that whole arena.
Well, you hit the main point that was there, which is that, these animals spend a majority of their day eating, and the quantity they eat is a huge quantity as is related to their mass. Do you believe in the idea that the evolution of human beings, and especially the explosion of our brain, directly was related to our ability to concentrate calories, in particular, things like protein.
Yeah, I really do. I think nutrient density was a very important aspect of human development, that we could get so much of our diet in much more concentrated calorie forms. That's haunting us a little now that the food industry has learned to put very concentrated calories in highly palatable foods, ranging from donuts to chips. So, it's sort of a blessing and also a curse now with modern food industries. But clearly, nutrient density is important to human existence and allowed us to evolve. And I mean, your comment earlier about, I think a lot of vegetarians are hearing the message about protein and understanding the issue about aging. And, I will always say that, if a person's able to eat 120 grams of protein or more per day, they can probably be vegetarian. It's hard to eat that in natural foods. And so that probably means they're going to end up having some processed protein powders or things like that to make that work. But you can do it, but it requires some knowledge. I mean, I could put it together, but I've studied nutrition for 40 years. I know the average person on the street can't put that together. So, it's again, by all means, it can be done. I think we have to work carefully when we start putting it into public health recommendations. When we start saying we're going to make all nursing homes and all high schools and all daycares and all hospitals subscribe to a plant-based diet, that's a real risk, because we have at-risk people in environments that may not be able to balance it. And so those are where, I don't really care if a 30-year-old female with a good knowledge of nutrition wants to be vegetarian. That's great. But I really worry if my mom in a nursing home is limited to a plant-based diet that causes her to lose lean body mass. That's a problem.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
Heart disease and obesity on this side, fatty liver disease and Alzheimer's over here. All depending on what your liver will do with the fat it made from the sugar.